Hey everyone, welcome back to another week of virtual Sunday school. We are continuing in our series on vibes. If you haven't seen the other videos, you can still watch them on our Instagram. But before we get started, let me pray. Dear Jesus, I thank you for this week. I thank you for our students. I thank you for the snow. God, I pray that you would be with each of us as we're starting back to school or going back to work. Help us to shine bright for you, God, and be love to our neighbors and our friends. It's in your name we pray. Amen. So in high school, I was a cheerleader. I cheered all throughout middle school. I cheered my freshman year. I loved to cheer. But after my freshman year, it was time to try out for the varsity cheer team. It was my first time ever trying out for a varsity team. It's my first time ever trying out against people older than me. It would be all the sophomores, juniors, and seniors trying to make this one team, and that scared me. Scared me so bad that I eventually talked myself out of trying out for cheer and joined the soccer team. Like, so scared that I wouldn't make this one team, even though I cheered all through middle school, cheered freshman year. I never even played soccer before. And because I was so scared, I convinced myself that I shouldn't try out for the sport I played my whole life and played a whole different sport so that I wouldn't have to try out and not make the cheer team. What kind of sense does that make? But fear can do that. That's the thing. We've been talking about vibes. We've been talking about emotions. And the thing about emotions is that we all experience them. And sometimes, without us even realizing it, these vibes can end up controlling us in unhealthy ways. Whether it's keeping you from hanging out with people or getting you so scared that you don't even try out for the team that you want to be on. We end up being controlled by these vibes. And so today I want to talk about this one thing, this one emotion that really fights to control us, and that's fear. All of us have experienced fear in some form or another. It's kept us from trying new things. It's hurt our friendships. It's created this script in our head that convinces us of things about us or things about our lives that aren't true. The thing about fear, the crazy thing about fear, is that our ability to experience it is something that makes us human. Think about it. Our fear comes from the fact that we gather information and we can think about the future. As human, we can wonder, what if? What if this happens or that happens? And that's what makes us afraid. We are where we are today because the human race has been able to accumulate knowledge, build on that knowledge, and then project it into the future. It's why we have continued to develop and change and evolve as a race. Same ability that allows us to fear allows us to imagine and hope and dream, which are great things. So our ability to gather information and think about the future is two sides, the fear side and the hope side. And I think we would all agree that the hope side's awesome. We love imagining and dreaming and inventing, but then we have this fear side, the side that comes up with all these what ifs. And we all know the what ifs make us a bit crazy. They make our world shrink until our world is small and made up of all these things that make us afraid. Think about the last thing you were afraid of, about how much of your day was spent thinking and stressing over it. That midterm, what is going back to school with a certain pandemic going to look like? Does he or she like me back? If you're anything like me, it's all day. It's most of your day. You're thinking about it, working through scenarios, planning what to say or do. That's what happens when fear takes over. Our world gets really small. Our world becomes this fear. But here's some good news. Jesus had a lot to say about fear. The problem is we tend to read the verses where he talks about fear by themselves. And then we do that and it sounds nice, but they don't seem possible or practical. For example, Jesus said, "Fear not." In other words, don't fear, just stop. It's not exactly helpful. Today I want to look at a passage where Jesus talks about this to some of his close friends with a little bit more context. Jesus had 12 main people, his disciples, who followed him and learned from him. He was their teacher, and they were his disciples. They also happened to be his close friends. And at one point he tells them, Matthew 10:16, "I'm going to send you out like sheep among the wolves. Think about it. Wolves are predators, sheep are prey. Jesus is like, you guys are the prey. I'm going to send you out with a bunch of predators, the ones that you usually run away from. We're just going to send you right in. And then he gets more literal. He tells them they will be arrested and beaten. And to wrap it all up, he tells them, don't be afraid. Like, I'm sending you out, but no worries. Sounds easy, right? We tend to read this story and stop there, but when you look at it in context, this is just part of a bigger story. Jesus took his friends on a field trip before this conversation, and this is where it's all connected. They were in this boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and while they were there, Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples, says this. Matthew 8:24. Suddenly, a furious storm came up from the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. Jesus and his disciples are on this small boat in the middle of the water, and without warning, a storm shows up. They think about all this noise from the wind and the rain and the water and the thunder. They're on this little bitty boat in the middle of it. Not exactly a leisurely cruise. And what is Jesus doing in the middle of this crazy storm? Oh, he's asleep. Can you imagine? The disciples were scared out of their minds, quite frankly, worried about their lives, and their fearless leader is just sleeping through it. So naturally, they wake him up. Casually, they head over to Jesus and say, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. Disciples are frustrated, they feel alone, and most of all scared, and they want their leader to wake up and take action. But how does he respond? He says, you of little faith, why are you afraid? You can only imagine the disciples' response. They stand there, soaked to the bone from the rain, wobbling around by the waves, and just point around them. And Jesus wasn't paying attention to what was in front of them. He was teaching them something. He was teaching them about fear. So he gets up, he doesn't panic, which is kind of used to make a point. No matter how scary the circumstances are, Jesus stays calm. Then Matthew says that Jesus spoke to the wind and the waves, and they calmed down. The disciples were amazed. They respond by saying this, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. And they thought about what they saw. This is unbelievable. The wind and the waves obey him. Now, they weren't just amazed. They were afraid. Like, who is this man who can calm a storm? He has power. And he used it to take care of them, and he was never afraid. In a moment, their confidence in Jesus overwhelmed their fear of the storm. That's the point of this field trip Jesus took them on, to show them that their feelings of fear didn't have to control them or boss them around. Show them that there is someone bigger and more capable than whatever they are afraid of. Back to the conversation where Jesus says he's going to send them out like sheep among wolves. Jesus follows that up by saying this, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill your soul. In other words, if you're fearing something, might as well make sure it's the right thing. A storm isn't nearly as big as God, and these dangerous situations I'm sending you out into, like sheep among wolves, don't be afraid, because they aren't as big as God either. He's saying, remember that boat ride? You were afraid of the wrong thing. Sure, you had a right to be afraid, but you didn't know that there was someone with you who is more powerful than this thing you're afraid of. Jesus goes on. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. Even the very hairs of your head are all numbered, so don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Jesus is saying, God is paying attention to you. Don't be afraid. You're worth more than the sparrows. Don't be afraid. God has numbered the hairs on your head. Don't be afraid. He's reminding us and says, you're valuable to him. God is close. He knows your circumstances. He's concerned with what happens to you every single day, your real life. He cares about what you care about. When it comes to dealing with fear, this is the big deal, because God knows all about it and he's with you in the middle of it. But Jesus isn't done teaching them about fear. They go on to another field trip. Jesus has been preaching all day. It starts getting late. People are getting tired and hungry. Disciples suggest that they send everyone home to go eat. But Jesus seems to think that they can feed everybody, which sounds crazy because no one has enough food or money to make that happen. This wasn't a small group of people. These were thousands of people. So the disciples are afraid again. How will they make this happen? How can they possibly do this? And then Jesus gets the little boy's lunch, he prays over it, And then Matthew says that Jesus split the boys' lunch between the 12 disciples and told them to feed the crowd. And it worked. Everyone's fed. It's a miracle. But before they have time to stop, to stay and enjoy it, Jesus tells the disciples to get in another boat. Probably thinking, too soon, Jesus, too soon. Remember what happened last time? But they get in the boat anyways. Except plot twist, Jesus doesn't get in with them. He tells them he'll meet them on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So the disciples spend the night rowing. At some point in the night, the waves get bigger and the wind blows. And they have to be thinking, great, we're in another storm again, but this time Jesus isn't even there. They look out in the water and they can't believe what they see. It's Jesus walking on the water. Matthew records that the disciples were terrified. In fact, they thought they had saw a ghost. But then Jesus says something that gets their attention because they had heard it before. Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Jesus is trying to remind them of all the lessons, all the field trips they've been on up to this point. They've seen miracles, they've heard the teaching, and yet fear was still controlling them. In fact, fear even controlled them after this trip. They remained fearful to the very end of Jesus' life. When we fast forward to the night Jesus was arrested, we see the disciples abandoned Jesus. Why? Because they were afraid that if they stayed close by, they might be arrested too. And then Jesus was crucified, and where were they? They left because they were afraid. Next day, Jesus is buried. Where were the disciples? They were hiding in a room because they were afraid. But then Sunday came around, and the women who had followed Jesus went to the tomb and saw that it was empty. And they came back and told the disciples. The disciples went to the tomb. They see it's empty too. Thought that someone had stolen the body. But then Jesus himself appears before them, and they realize he's alive. And here's the deal. When the guy you've been following dies and then comes back to life, suddenly everything he has said to you before seems more real, more true, more believable. Suddenly all the times he's told you to not be afraid makes sense. He can conquer death itself, so he can handle whatever you're afraid of. See, for the disciples who loved and followed Jesus, resurrection wasn't just a nice surprise, it was everything. It made them bold, gave them strength, and put everything Jesus said about fear in perspective. Their world was crazy, but because of the resurrection, the disciples and anyone who followed Jesus could put their fear aside and put it in its place. It was like they finally understood the lesson from the boat. When all these things around them seemed so much bigger and scarier than they could handle, now Jesus' words made sense. Fear not, I'm with you, took on a whole new meaning. We know this is true because after the resurrection, the disciples came out of hiding. They didn't run away from authorities. They started preaching to them. And these followers of Jesus ended up changing the world. Why? Because they started to live as though they believed what Jesus had told them all their lives was true. Fear not. They believed, they lived afraid of nothing, not even death, because they followed a man who had died, come back to life. All of a sudden, nothing seemed scary anymore. Not because there was nothing to be afraid of, but because God was clearly bigger than their biggest fears. So, because of this week, remember, when you're scared, when fear is controlling you, when it's telling you to not put yourself out there, to not join that team, to not talk to that person, to stay small, keep your world in this little box, remember that you don't have to feel scared because Jesus is with you, and your fears are rightfully so. You're scared for good reason. But you have a God bigger than your fears, who's with you in the storm, who cares about you, and has counted the numbers on your head and isn't going to let anything hurt you. He loves you. And having the most powerful God on your side who loves you and cares about you allows you to not live in fear, but to live in hope and dream bigger than you have before. So I hope that you remember that this week, and as you're going back to school, to not live in fear, but to live bold and love the people around you without being tied down to your fear. We'll see you next week.